Hello, my guest today is Madhu Sarin, who works on rural development, community management of natural resources, and women's empowerment. She was one of the campaigners for the Forest Rights Act, or as it's formally known, the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act. It was passed in 2006 and notified in 2007. In this interview, we'll discuss the antecedents of the act and where we are now. Welcome to the Wild Women Interviews, Madhu.
Thank you.
Let me start off by asking you these three frivolous questions that I lifted off the Proust questionnaire. What gives you happiness?
Happiness is seeing everyone else around happy, particularly my pets. I love to see my doggies frolicking around and looking very content and pampered.
Who are your heroes or heroines?
I don't think I have any, I can't think of anyone in particular. Um,
That's okay. What is
yeah.
your guiltiest pleasure?
Mm, it's my guiltiest pleasure. Again, I
Chocolate?
can't.
No?
Huh?
Chocolate?
What?
Eating chocolate?
No.
No.
I'm not particularly fond of chocolate. Um, can't think of any actually.
Okay. All right. That's all right. So tell me about yourself. How did you come to be involved in the drafting of the tribal bill? That's what it was called at first, right? Like what were the circumstances that led to the drafting of the bill?
I think the major trigger was, at that time, the Supreme Court had got very involved in protecting forests. I mean, they were getting hyperactive, and in the middle of all that, it they issued this order in May 2002, asking all so-called encroachers on forest land being evicted within 5 months. And before we knew it, there were, forest departments going around brutally evicting Adivasis from their lands. In Madhya Pradesh, as far as I remember, there was a case. We had a public hearing in Delhi, and this was reported there of this woman in labor, being dragged out of her hut to set the hut on fire. They were really awful cases. So that brought a lot of groups working on in different states on these issues together. And there was a meeting in Delhi, and I have been very involved with forest issues um, for various reasons. And I attended this meeting, and that was kind of, that led to the birth of what we came to be known as the Campaign for Survival and Dignity, which became a kind of an umbrella, platform for groups, activist groups from different states coming together and fighting initially against these eviction orders. To say that, look, all these people are not encroachers. And in any case, this is no way of dealing with, the encroachment issue. And from there, it, progressively moved forward, and we arrived at the Forest Rights Act.
Wasn't it also the case that that a lot of these areas where these evictions were happening were actually Schedule 5 areas meant to be tribal areas?
Yes, of course.
Could
Of
you tell
course,
us a
that
little bit about that? Like what is a Schedule 5 tribal area? What rights do tribal communities have under the schedule?
Well, under the fifth schedule of the Constitution, these areas which are brought under that schedule uh, provides for uh, special protection of the resource and other rights of tribal communities. Majority of these have have to be, majority scheduled tribe areas, and it protects their rights. So that's one. Plus, it provides for special governance arrangements. So you have this extension of panchayats to scheduled areas act, PESA, as it's called in short, um, which provides gram sabhas with special powers and authority to have a say in the management of community resources, etc. So uh, the one of the major issues was that, hey, these are constitutionally protected areas for tribal rights. The first problem has been that these same areas were notified as forests, often without following the due process of law. For example, in Andhra Pradesh, I mean, at that time I had calculated something like 65% of the Schedule 5 areas had been, through a two-line order declared to be forests. And there was no settlement of rights, no examination or survey to actually find out whether these areas actually had forests or not. Because a lot of the areas even didn't have forests, but they had been called forests on paper. And so we questioned that, one of the big questions was that, hey, the people inhabiting these areas have special protections under the Constitution. How can superimposed law in these areas, where in fact one could even question the validity of this, the Indian Forest Act being superimposed in a Schedule 5 area, how can that overrule a constitutional protection? So that was the big, fight, and we questioned this whole eviction business, particularly in scheduled areas. Not only in scheduled areas, actually everywhere. You take Uttarakhand and Himachal with 66% land notified as forests. There are very few scheduled tribes, but forest dwellers or forest dependent people are still, equally dependent. And so that's.
So, who are all the people involved in this effort? I mean, you don't have to list them exhaustively, just a few key players would be interesting to know.
I think at that time, probably the lead was taken by Kashkari Sangathan in Maharashtra, with led by Pradeep Prabhu. Then there were groups from Andhra Pradesh, from Madhya Pradesh, from Odisha. I mean, it basically, given the crisis created by these horrific evictions, people just came together. And I think initially it was really Pradeep who was in the lead, articulating. He also had all these contacts with political, figures and in political parties, particularly with the left. At that time, UPA government was there, and the CPIM in particular had quite a lot of say, and they were very involved they supported our battle against these evictions.
So, in the first iteration, when it was known as the tribal bill, what did it set out to do?
I don't think there was any major difference between, in what the bill set out to do initially and later, when non-tribals, or who were called other traditional forest dwellers, were also included in the act. The very first thing was, to say that these people are not encroachers, to recognize their rights. then it expanded from there to say, hey, this is only the tip of the iceberg. You know, there are, because this only addressed the question of land under cultivation. But forests in tribal areas have a much, much broader, role in tribal economies as well as cultures. So it is not just land, forest land under cultivation, but access to forest for all their other needs, non-timber forest produce, even timber, um cultivation, of course, and then different types of cultivation. You know, there's one of the more contentious issues has been shifting cultivation, where, what's called slash and burn agriculture, where, they cut forests and cultivate, but then let it regrow. But the forest department, of course, treats it as a, big violation of the Forest Conservation Act.
First iteration, it had a very narrow scope. It only talked about tribal communities, and then the scope expanded to include other traditional forest communities. So what led to the change from an act that was specifically for tribal communities to then include other people as well?
Well, I mean, I think I actually had quite a lot to do with that. Coming from this region, like I said, you look at Himachal and Uttarakhand, they are forested states with hardly any tribal population. And if we only had a tribal bill, then it would not, cover these states. But more importantly, even in tribal areas, uh, the percentage of tribal population varies from area to area, state to state. Even in tribal areas, the way the scheduling of tribes has taken place, it's just, if you look at the criteria by and the process by which the scheduling takes place, it's absolutely bizarre. The criteria for a scheduled tribe has to be primitive in nature, has to be backward, silly things like that. And so who gets scheduled as a tribe and who gets left out? There is no clear boundary, separating the two. Very often in one state, one community is scheduled as a tribe. In the adjoining state, they are not scheduled. And it's the same people, with this interrelationship and same families, maybe some people living in one state. And this was particularly the case, I think, between Andhra Pradesh and Orissa, and also I think Orissa and Madhya Pradesh. Uh, so it just made no sense, and also to say that it's not due to this official classification as a scheduled tribe which determines your dependence on the forest. You have to look at the actual dependence. And so there are a lot of people who actually officially should be scheduled as tribes, but have not been and are highly dependent. And then there are others who are not scheduled tribes and maybe don't qualify to be scheduled as tribes, but are, primarily dependent on forests. So on what grounds do you exclude one lot uh, at the cost, for the benefit of the other? So we just said it needs to be based on dependence on the forest and customary rights and access.
So, is that why the Ministry of Tribal Affairs became the nodal agency for implementing the FRA?
Absolutely, yes. Although we included other traditional forest dwellers, the majority, it was assumed, across the country would be tribals. And one major consideration was that it should not be the Ministry of Environment and Forest, because they would never recognize rights. I mean, that was our belief, that if they were made the nodal agency, almost like a, uh, almost like a zamindar, they would protect their control over the land and not recognize rights. So that's why we say, and we really felt that MOEF was too focused on forests, and not on the people, and it was very important to bring in uh, the fact that these are inhabited, landscapes, whether forested or not. And the people need to be recognized as major stakeholders and right holders.
Does it seem to you now, looking back over the last, 13 years since the Forest Rights Act came into being, that the Tribal Affairs Ministry has had the muscle to implement the law?
I think, I think a major problem has been that the Ministry of Tribal Affairs is firstly very small. Secondly, it's very weak. At that time, when I was interacting a lot with the ministry, it only had one or two joint secretaries, whereas the Ministry of Environment and Forest had 10, 20 or whatever, huge number of staff. And then there are forest departments in every state. Ministry of Tribal Affairs, MOTA for short, doesn't have any state cadre or anything. It's very weak in comparison.
So, how did you
So,
imagine they would stand up to the Ministry of Environment and Forests in implementing the law? I mean, I'm asking now with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, I'm aware of that, but I'm just trying to figure out what the thought process was at that time.
well, the main consideration was that MOEF will never recognize rights. And the one ministry which has the maximum stakes and, in fact, responsibility for doing so is the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. We're aware that it is weak. You know, it has very poor strength, very limited staff, but it is its mandate, which at least we needed someone to take on the Ministry of Environment and Forests, and which to some extent it has done weakly, as was anticipated, because it just doesn't have that muscle which the environment ministry has. But it also depends on which officers are in place, because if you get one good officer sitting in the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, they can take on a lot, and we've had a few of those as well.
You also work on women's empowerment. So, did you have women in mind while drafting the FRA? How did you think the act would empower women in forest areas?
Well, I think the first thing was that the act provides that titles, issued by recognizing rights will be in the joint names of husband and wife. And in the case of a single person, would be in the name of whoever it is, man or woman. So that way, uh, women's equal entitlement, at least legally or formally through the titles, was ensured. And also, there is a provision that in meetings of the Gram Sabha, that there's a minimum quorum of 50%. And out of that, for any Gram Sabha meeting to have validity, at least one third of those present must be women. So, I mean, these are mechanical kind of, rules, etc. But at least it makes sure that women don't get forgotten. And where they are somewhat aware and organized, they can use these provisions to their advantage.
So there was a lot of pushback from the wildlife conservation community, and the pushback continues even today. And their what concerns, or at least their claims, are that this law allows for land distribution and encourages forest encroachment. What do you say to them to deal with those issues?
Well, we had to fight with them all the time while fighting for the act itself, because this was their argument. And our um, response has always been that, look, I mean, you're looking at forests as uninhabited landscapes, which is a myth. On the ground, these are inhabited landscapes. People have coexisted with forests, and especially in the case of tribal communities or even other forest dwelling communities. I mean, you take Uttarakhand and Himachal, they're not tribal, but people have um, a particular relationship with their environment and their forests, and you can't just try and take people out of the equation and say that they they are destructive. um, in fact, if you look at it, some of the best protected forests are where communities have protected them, which is the case till today. If you look at, you know, the quality of forests, some of the community protected forests. You look at Uttarakhand, the one panchayat forest. You look at Odisha, the self-initiated forest protection, taken up by villagers. I mean, they're far superior to any reserve forest managed by the forest department.
But I mean, arguing from their point of view, I'm not saying this is what I believe, but their contention is that there has to be some area at least where wildlife can live and breed and live their lives with no disturbance from humans, and therefore the need for national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. And if you look at the vast area of the country, it's already taken up by people. So shouldn't wildlife have its own areas?
Um, I don't think anyone has ever said that they shouldn't. The argument has been that where people are already there, you know, picking them up and throwing them out in the name of wildlife conservation is not acceptable. Uh, it could be, in certain cases, people voluntarily want to move out, once all kinds of restrictions are imposed in protected areas, etc. That's a different matter. But where they are already there, they have been coexisting with wildlife. In fact, they can become, partners in conservation, or they have been. I mean, you have a lot of communities which worship the tiger, and will protect it at any cost. So just assuming that all people are anti-conservation or anti-wildlife doesn't make sense. So the argument was that where people are there, let them be, unless they themselves want to move out.
But
Or, yeah.
this, like, people can adjust to different circumstances of life, whereas animals cannot. I'm just saying this for argument's sake. I'm just playing the devil's advocate. So is there not validity in that argument that we should move people out of forest to create the space for wildlife? People can survive. I mean, they can, whatever they grow here, they could grow there, right?
It's not quite as simple as that. I think for communities which have lived for generations in a particular area, and suddenly you come with this bizarre concept that wildlife needs to be separated from you, and you hinder their ability to exist as they would prefer. I mean, they've already been coexisting, so it doesn't make any sense. You're talking of a hypothetical situation which doesn't bear any semblance to reality.
Right. But let's say you're growing crops, and if elephants and deer and other herbivores come and eat your crops, you suffer as a farmer, whereas outside of forest you won't suffer these, these conflict situations. So isn't it better for people to be outside forests? I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm sorry.
No, I look, I'm very clear. I'm not one of the, I'm not personally affected by this. My only consideration would be that it's the people concerned who should have a say, right? Um, I think there have been cases where people have preferred to move out if they've been given a good relocation package. I think it happened in Karnataka recently. There are other cases where people are quite content. I mean, they can manage. They have learned to coexist.
with this implementing of this act, since it's not being implemented uniformly across the country. In some cases there is actually um, the implementation is so poor, rights aren't being granted. So, and in some cases the court cases have stopped the implementation of the act. So how do we go forward? Is there a way of going forward without first letting these cases go through court? What does it take?
I think ultimately it'll depend on it, pressure from the ground, and these things become important mostly when there are threats, when suddenly, like, I mean, the origin of the FRA lies in the evictions. The suddenly lakhs, if not millions of people were threatened with eviction and everyone was up in arms. When nothing much of that sort is happening, no one seems to care particularly. There may be individual scattered cases of people being harassed for cultivating forest land. So those people end up not benefiting from a movement with everyone else joining. But if it happens on any scale, then it becomes a totally different issue, and that's when people you know collectively protest or demand. That's what happened at the time of the FRA's enactment, and there hasn't really been, excepting occasionally in pockets, when there were efforts to again start evictions, when people come together and start protesting. Now they at least have a law they can fall back upon and demand its implementation. But otherwise, it doesn't really seem to matter too much to people.
So, besides individual rights, the FRA also grants these community rights to communities to protect forests, and that has an even poorer record of implementation than individual rights. So, we don't seem to like, even during the British time, they didn't recognize community ownership of land. If someone didn't have an individual land title, it was just considered state land, or that state took it over. And we still seem to have the same hang up about these community, like a collective management of a piece of land. So how are we going to recognize the that communities can also play a role in conservation?
See, once again, I think it depends on local context. I mean, I've been looking at Himachal. It's the closest state to me, and I visit for I'm associated with an NGO there. And recently we were discussing this, and in Himachal, there's been very little claiming of rights under the FRA. And I was asking my friend working in this NGO, and in a sense, we were trying to think, and if you look at Himachal today, it is like a lower middle class state. A very high percentage of people have government jobs. Who has the time, to protect and conserve community forests? What is the nature of their remaining dependence on it? Why the hell would they bother? There was a time I remember, in fact, I've been in protest demos with women from Himachal, where they were protesting against the forest department coming and bunging eucalyptus trees in their grasslands, because for them fodder was critical. But the economy has been changing. That was about 20, 25 years ago. Today, I don't think livestock is that important any longer. In Himachal's economy. Of course, in pockets it will continue to be. So, who would put up a fight for protecting the grassland? It doesn't bother people. So, it depends where people are very dependent. You take the case of Niyamgiri. They put up a fight because you know, it, they, not only are they dependent on the forest, but it's also their cultural, spiritual, place, POSCO for that matter. So where there is dependence, people will put up a fight. But where that kind of dependence no longer exists, in a sense, it's better if the forest department takes charge, because the local people don't have the time. They are into other things. Their entire livelihoods have changed, and their dependence on the forest has increased.
Thank you very much, Madhu, for talking to us about the antecedents of the FRA. That was very enlightening. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.